Hey, it's Brennan. I'm here again to bring you a little bit more analysis, and this time it's on the sequel to the previous game I covered. Today I'm going to be covering Resident Evil 8 Village. Similar to my previous analysis, I'll give a bit of a story rundown just so that you know who the characters are and the general sort of flow of things, and then I'll break things down and go into a bit more analysis. There's a few areas where I didn't feel I did things quite enough justice in my previous video, so I've tried to improve the way I'm presenting this one. Without further ado, let's get started. We start the game off with a very Tim Burton-esque storybook sequence, and it's Mia's voice reading out a storybook that displays a tale that can be quite heavily mirrored to the events that happen within the game. This is a pretty cool sort of foreshadowing technique. I really appreciate what Capcom was doing here, and it very much sets the tone for what we're going to be seeing going forward. Then, after the storybook sequence is done, we cut to Mia and Ethan, and their newborn baby, Rose. This sets up quite a light-hearted atmosphere, and very much follows a particular set of classic horror tropes. We're sort of only just getting started here, so it's really about introducing us to Ethan and Rose and Mia, and getting us into the flow of the story. There's a bit of tension between Mia and Ethan, and they argue a little bit, and it appears they've argued multiple times about the events of the previous game. Ethan very much wants to talk about what happened, discuss it so that he can process things and move on, but Mia seems oddly cut off. All of a sudden, Mia is shot, and seemingly killed, right in front of Ethan. And then Chris Redfield walks in, and doesn't explain anything. Ethan then has Rose snatched from him, and he himself is also kidnapped by Chris Redfield's team, and is taken to where the story's real events start happening. In the middle of the frozen winter, out in the middle of Eastern Europe. Here we begin the real journey into the Village of Shadows. We start off with a very tense walk up to the village, seeing things out the corner of Ethan's eyes, and then we come to our first house. Nothing much happens, but then we move on, and we start seeing more and more things. More of the village, the animals and the people that seemingly lived here, gone or dead. And then Ethan comes to the first house where he meets a survivor. The survivor is very panicked, and hands him quickly a gun before things go kind of haywire, and Ethan suddenly gets half his fingers chewed off. The meme continues. After then being thrown into a pit of dead bodies under the house, Ethan is then thrown outside, where he fights off a horde of these new lichens. Then, very reminiscent of another game, the horde is called away by the tolling of a bell, and Ethan comes across an old lady, who gives him very cryptic clues as to what might be going on. From a radio earlier on, we hear that Ethan needs to proceed to a cornfield, so Ethan makes his way to this cornfield and this house that is located within it. Here Ethan discovers a woman and a man, a daughter and a father. After finding our way into the house, we then discover there is a group of survivors. Now, I would give you a bit more description here, but we don't really know these people too well. All we know is that the father is infected in some way with the lichen disease, whatever it is. And so, he attacks and kills everybody. And as Ethan is running away with the daughter, seemingly having escaped unscathed, she falls to her fiery death. And Ethan is frustrated, but he knows he must move on. After collecting the two little pieces that we need for the door, we move into the most interesting section of the game. That is the Castle Dimitrescu. Ethan is ambushed by a man with magnetic powers. And no, it's not Magneto. Here, Ethan is taken to a meeting of the Four Lords and their leader. Here we learn the names and general relationship of some of the lords, but I'll just list them all off for you. Moreau, the rotten fish man, who is very timid and very weak by comparison to the others. Beneviento, the doll maker, and her very trusty doll. Lady Dimitrescu, and of course, the man who brought us here, Heisenberg. We'll analyse these characters later, but for now, it is decided by the leader of these four lords, Mother Miranda, that Ethan shall be killed by Heisenberg's method, chased down by a horde of Lycans and put through a series of traps. Obviously, we make it through these traps and move back into where we started, going up to the Castle Dimitrescu. Here, we also meet the Duke. The Duke is a pretty interesting character, but for now, it's only introductions. Ethan makes his way up into the castle, and then things get a little crazy. Here in the Castle Dimitrescu, things are very mysterious, and we come across the three daughters of Alcina Dimitrescu. Her three daughters, Bella, Cassandra, and Daniela. Ethan is dragged away by the three women to a chamber where Lady Dimitrescu herself is. And here, Ethan is put up onto two hooks where he struggles to free himself and heal himself with this mysterious ointment that we know from Resident Evil 7. We explore the castle, go through all these different chambers. Here we discover that the three daughters are weak to the cold, and so destroy them. This angers Lady Dimitrescu, and after getting the four masks, we come across the most valuable possession of the castle, the one knife that can kill Lady Dimitrescu herself. And after stabbing Lady Dimitrescu and getting stabbed himself, Ethan defeats Lady D. Curse you! After defeating Lady D, we can then move on to actually discover where and why things are happening. And the flask that Ethan picked up after defeating Lady D actually is revealed to us by the Duke to be one of Rose's body parts. This obviously disturbs Ethan, but he must press on if he wants to find his daughter. So, the Duke tells Ethan where he needs to go. He needs to defeat the other three lords, Beneviento, Moreau, and Heisenberg, and so the chase begins. We start off by going towards Beneviento's mansion, where things are mostly focused on hallucinations. Here, very reminiscent of Resident Evil 7, we see Ethan experiencing a lot of hallucinations, particularly revolving around his wife and his daughter. After going through a tense puzzle section where Ethan comes across many harrowing, disturbing things, then Ethan is finally able to defeat the doll and the doll maker herself, Beneviento. And then we move on to the next lord, Moreau. Now, Moreau is a weak, disgusting fish man, but he's also very cunning, and tries to trap Ethan in many ways. This obviously doesn't work. Before fighting Moreau, we come across Chris Redfield again, but once again, Ethan gets no explanation. And so after defeating Moreau, we then have 3 of the 4 flasks we need. Moving back to where Moreau actually keeps the flask, we then hear a message from Heisenberg, a challenge from Heisenberg himself. Heisenberg actually tells Ethan that if he wants to actually win and get the flasks that he needs to head to a very specific location, the Den of the Lycans. After fighting through this Den of Lycans, Ethan grabs what he needs, the final flask of his daughter Rose. Here, we can put all 4 flasks into the center stone block and move on to actually defeat Heisenberg. After a quick lift ride, we make our way through and actually roam through the halls of Heisenberg's demented laboratory. We see his various creations and the things that he's done to the people of the village for so long. And finally, Ethan comes face to face with Heisenberg, and is then thrown down a pit. However, after falling down this pit, finally Ethan comes face to face again with Chris Redfield, but this time he actually gets an explanation as to what's going on. Finally, we learn that Mother Miranda has taken Rose for her own benefit, and the reason that he shot Mia in the beginning was actually because it was Mother Miranda in disguise. And though it is Mia and Ethan's baby, Miranda wants to take it for herself, and that's why she posed as Mia, so that she could gain access to the child, take it for herself, and make it into her own, who she lost many years ago. We then begin the very epic battle against Heisenberg, finishing him off with a massive tank explosion, and then we are faced with Mother Miranda, and Ethan has his heart ripped out. This kills Ethan. For now. Until we move on to Chris's section. Here, Chris Redfield goes through the village with his team, defeating all the Lycans that he can, before finally coming face to face with the Mega Mycete, throwing a bomb onto it, before then finding Mia inside Mother Miranda's personal laboratory. Here, we can roam around and discover a bit more about Mother Miranda, but here we get the explanation from Mia that Ethan was never alive, so having his heart ripped out didn't kill him. We finally move on to see that Ethan is back, and really, he's been molded this entire time, so his regenerative abilities are as a result of the Mutamycete and the Megamycete, which are linked entities. Ethan then makes his way heroically to the final battle, bidding farewell to the Duke who has saved him for the final time, and then facing off against Mother Miranda. After defeating Mother Miranda and saving his daughter, Ethan is then too weak to go on. He hands his baby Rose over to Chris, and heroically sacrifices himself by detonating the explosion that defeats the Mega Mycete. Chris, Mia, and Rose fly off, and we get the ending credits. And in a post-credits scene, we get Rose, fully grown up many years later, visiting Ethan's grave. Here she speaks with an agent briefly about her powers, which is obviously setting up the DLC, where there's more to the story. And they drive off into the sunset together, to a mysterious figure who is walking up the road. Now, we move into the analysis portion. I won't be going over the Shadows of Rose DLC because I want to focus on the story as its own unique thing. I feel that key story points shouldn't be locked off to a DLC, so I'll be analysing the story as is. So, let's start with things that seem a little bit odd. So, first of all, the main thing that everyone always talks about, why does Chris Redfield not just explain the plan to Ethan earlier? Now, this is something they actually address later on in the game. Why isn't Chris just telling Ethan? And he doesn't respond, basically. He just goes, yeah, I should have. So then that brings us the question of, well, if he should have explained the plan to Ethan, why didn't he from the very beginning? The idea that the writers were going for here is that Chris, wanting to keep Ethan safe, would, rather than think clearly about how actually explaining things to Ethan would lend themselves to doing things much easier, Instead, we get Chris Redfield keeping everything very secretive, and that leads to a lot of issues. It leads to Ethan finding out things rather than just hearing them from Chris himself. And when he finally meets up with Chris, it's combative rather than them being able to work together. However, if you've played previous entries of Resident Evil, it doesn't seem logical for Chris's character to do this. This seems, to me, very much like it was something that they wanted to put into the game to sort of fit the narrative. So it doesn't seem very logical for Chris's character to be so impulsive and not very forward-thinking like this, considering what he's been like in previous games. I do feel that this Chris plot point, or plot error, whatever you want to call it, is kind of in line with how they formed the story as a whole. There's a lot of things where it seems a bit too perfect, Deus Ex Machina, if you will, where things work out too well, and things kind of happen in a way that doesn't seem realistic. However, that's kind of done on purpose. Things in this game happen in a very, very ideal way, where in the previous game I do feel there was a lot more emphasis on Ethan having things go wrong and having to work with what he had, which is a lot more of a modern horror archetype. Here we get a lot more of Ethan having things just kind of go perfect. I mean, as a small sort of microcosm, let's think about the massive tank battle that we have with Heisenberg later in the game. He's flying up in the air, and seemingly out of nowhere, the tank arrives and he just manages to get on and finish off Heisenberg. That in itself is very unlikely to happen, and in the previous game probably wouldn't have happened. But because of what they are going for with this game, trying to emulate these classic horror tropes, that's just the way it works out. And it's the same with other things as well. The way that the Duke takes a liking to Ethan, and the way that we go into Luisa's house and things just work out perfectly for Ethan. Despite crashing the car, he still manages to get out the fire completely unscathed. Despite coming across the massive horde of Lycans, he just gets saved at the last second by the bell. Now with the Lycan fight, you could compare that to Resident Evil 4, however, it's a bit different in Resident Evil 4. In Resident Evil 4, Leon is a trained agent who knows exactly what he's doing. Because of his skill, he survives that fight with the villagers. The bell does save him, but he could handle himself, whereas here, Ethan is physically grabbed and about to get crushed by the very large Lycan, so him surviving is another stroke of luck, another instance of Deus Ex Machina. Now, moving on to another plot error that I find a little bit strange. The Luisa's house section. This section is so weird, I don't get why we meet these characters and they die, and we don't get to know them. It's very strange to me, and I don't see why the section happens at all, to be quite honest, other than to have Ethan find the fragment and to have Ethan frustrated with all these people dying, because we don't meet these characters for long enough to develop a connection to them. It almost feels like there was a larger section here, but it was cut out. In fact, all the characters that we meet in this section are sort of one-line characters. Like, literally, the drunk man in the room describes all of them in one line. It really makes the section feel awkward, especially with how Ethan tries to save her, but it doesn't work out, and he feels so emotionally distraught by it, and I get why, but the section does feel very awkward, even in the context of the story as a whole. And the final point I want to move on to when it comes to story analysis is this is very much a goofy story. It's supposed to be over the top, and that's why we meet these very over-the-top characters. Clearly the writers were trying to emulate classic horror. I've been saying classic horror a lot, and by classic horror I mean this specific subgenre of horror where it was very focused on monsters, and having a distinct villainous monster for the main character to fight. That is very much the sense that we get with each of the four lords and with Mother Miranda herself. It's fighting against monsters, and we, the hero Ethan, need to defeat them all to save his family. It's similar to Resident Evil 7, but with less of the grit and more of the grandiosity. And that's what the writers were going for with the whole story. So, with most of the story, especially with Dimitrescu's parts and Heisenberg's parts, I can really excuse quite a lot of the Deus Ex Machina and the over-the-top ridiculousness of the situation as being part of this genre, because it's not following the previous Resident Evil entries, it's not even following Resident Evil 7, it's its own thing once again, which I can really respect. Now, speaking of goofiness, we have to talk about the script and some of the line delivery that goes on here. Let's start with a line that's right near the beginning. My favourite line of the game.
Dead body? Wait, there's more.
I really love this line. I can't quite put into words how this makes me feel. I feel like when I'm watching this particular scene, like I'm watching a B horror movie, it's just perfect bad line delivery. It feels so out of place by comparison to some of the other lines where they managed to get the voice actor for Ethan to get these really good emotional payoffs. But sometimes his line delivery is a bit all over the place. Sometimes he sounds very Resident Evil 7 Ethan.
No. What?
Roses?
Don't say another word!
That very strained, confused sound. And then other times he's dropping one-liners like Duke Nukem.
I'm sick of bugs. Crazy witch. You're the one who's cursed. In death as he was in life. Disgusting.
It's very, very strange. But, of course, it's supposed to be goofy, and you're supposed to laugh at some parts of it. Some parts, bear in mind. And then there are some lines that just straight up don't make sense, at least to me. For example, when Ethan is faced with Chris right at the beginning, and he's taking Rose and killed Mia.
I said get your hands off her!
Ethan, no.
That line delivery, and it's not even just the awkward line delivery here, it's the script itself. The script is strange, and I'm not sure if it's a translation error or if it's supposed to be written this way. Now, I don't want to go too hard on this game for the script, because, I mean, come on, Resident Evil has never been about the script.
Wait, don't shoot!
Who are you?
Huh? You're not a zombie. Sorry about that little misunderstanding, but I thought you were another one of those monsters.
Shut up!
Resident Evil's story has always been a little bit, you know, B-movie horror, and the script is as well, and that's kind of par for the course. But, of course, where we're veering into the classic horror subgenre, this feels extra cheesy, and it's very good in a way, because it is emulating a lot of that old classic horror cheese that a lot of people really like. However, there are some parts where it's very, very hard to take seriously. Now, I mentioned once again, we're emulating classic horror, so let's go over some of the inspirations that clearly inspired each of the villains. So, a lot of the horror novels that I'll be referencing are from the 1800s, and that 1800s was an interesting period of time. It's known in Britain, at least, as the industrialization era. This was because religion has been so prominent in British history, at least, for so many years. And during this period of time, we were seeing a lot of new inventions come about, and in particular, the advent of modern science. A lot of scientists were now turning away from religion, and it was creating a very harsh divide within the country. We can see that during this period of time, there was a lot of turmoil in that way. So, a lot of books were written based around either mechanics and the difference between human and machine, or religion. Lady Dimitrescu is a very obvious reference to Bram Stoker's Dracula. Now, to analyse Lady D a bit more, let's focus on Bram Stoker's Dracula. Bram Stoker in Dracula focused on religion. Dracula himself is supposed to be akin to the devil, and within the novel as a whole, he's seen as a demonic figure, and there's a lot of references to religious events that happen in the Bible. We see a lot of parallels with Lady D and this sort of religious theming. All throughout the castle, there seems to be small little references to religion. Aside from Lady D, there's various references to the Holy Trinity and various things throughout the game. The raven on the little emblem you put on the door in the Beneviento house puzzle is sort of a mirror image to the Dove of Peace. Throughout the game, we get these references to sacrifice, satanic worship. This is something we'd expect a bit more in other games, but Resident Evil has never been too much about this, so these religious themings are very new to Resident Evil and pretty unique, and something that actually makes the game very memorable. Then we move on to Beneviento, the doll maker. There have been so many creepy dolls within horror as a whole. We could easily talk about Annabelle, or Slappy, or whichever doll you want to. A lot of them kind of follow the same outlines of being creepy doll that's possessed. It can fly around, it can move things. You get the idea. The thing that's really interesting about the whole House Beneviento, though, is that it mixes things. We get a slight Lovecraftian sense from the big baby creature, and I know Lovecraft is overly referenced, but it is that incomprehensible, disgusting baby that's really stand out within the game. And the house itself almost feels like it's referencing a lot of haunted houses, a lot of those classic horror mansions. And then we move on to Moreau. Now, Moreau is interesting because he's semi-referencing 1800s body horror in that sort of proto-horror-esque way, but then also referencing this sort of 50s, 60s era of the Fishman and that whole craze that it was. Moreau also has some grotesque elements to him and elements of the Fly, which is interesting. This sort of half-man, half-animal beast. It's a very cool concept. Then we have Heisenberg. Heisenberg, to me, seems like a very obvious reference to Frankenstein. The creations that he makes are half man, half machine, which is also a part of the steampunk aesthetic that it is. All these mechanical beings that are pieced together from dead bodies, much in a similar way to Frankenstein. They roam around in this lifeless state, powered by the Kadu and the mechanical parts that Heisenberg has attached to them. It's pretty cool, pretty interesting. Certainly, Heisenberg's character is quite unique, and other than Lady D, I'd say he's one of the more memorable things about the game for sure. However, I don't get what his magnetism power is referencing. If you guys know, maybe tell me in the comments. I don't know where the whole magnetism thing comes from, other than Magneto. I mean, come on. Now that I've talked about the main four lords, let's talk about the regular enemies and then actual Miranda herself. So, the Lycan are very clear references to werewolves. Then we have the giant Lycan creatures, which are giants and yetis, obviously. In the castle, we find the vampire things. Simple enough. We have the creepy dolls that follow around Beneviento. Then we have the very large beasts that we see a couple of times throughout the game, and they to me seem to be a reference to the Hound of the Baskervilles, and in general, beasts as a whole from that area of horror. Then we have the mechanical things that Heisenberg creates, and they're very clear references to Frankenstein. Then we come to Mother Miranda herself. Mother Miranda herself seems to be a cult-like figure. She has this following of people, particularly within the village, that worship her like a deity. And that's very much what she tries to come off as. I'm sure it's referencing a specific thing, but to me it seems more like a mix of references. Especially with her background as a scientist, it comes across as a varied mix of different things, and like Capcom was trying to create their own unique villain. It's cool, it's interesting, and it's certainly unique. Now that I'm done analysing Resident Evil 8 like it's some sort of movie, let's get into the actual gameplay aspects of it, and what it seems to be inspired by when it comes to gameplay. So, let's just start off with what it's very clearly mixing here. Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 7. There are so many game mechanics that are carried over from Resident Evil 4, and so many things that are carried over from Resident Evil 7. Let's start with the Duke, who is a very obvious reference to the merchant from Resident Evil 4.
What are you buying? Just something an old friend of mine used to say.
The Duke is different from the merchant, where the merchant is slimmer, and it seems implausible where the merchant can move in Resident Evil 4, and it seems even more implausible the Duke getting to these places. Especially with a whole horse-drawn carriage. There's not a whole lot of sense to it, who cares? In fact, even the Duke doesn't see any sense to his own character. It's sort of wacky and wild. Then we move on to the actual structure of the fights, where they are very clearly Resident Evil 4 inspired. We start the game off with a massive fight that you can't win. The enemies keep coming, like in Resident Evil 4, and you are saved by a bell tolling. When you come across enemies, you'll come across them in groups, and you're encouraged to take them down. You're encouraged to shoot at these enemies. Then we have the briefcase, which is another brought over mechanic with separate treasures and key items, and then the main weapons and weapon upgrades. Then we have a very large range of weapons. We have the ability to sell items and weapons. We have the ability to upgrade each weapon as we want. The categories that we upgrade are similar to Resident Evil 4. The setting of being in a village with a lot of infected villagers, the grandiose castles, the laboratory settings, the mines, there are a lot of similarities. There's also a lot of similarities to its predecessor, Resident Evil 7. There's a first-person perspective, there's big beast-like enemies, there's Ethan getting his hands cut up. Which reminds me, how does Ethan heal his sleeve there? Yeah, let's just ignore that. There are a lot of similarities to RE7, even the fact that he has to save, once again, a family member of his, and it ends with them flying off, but then there's also a few ways that it differs and sets itself apart. He's saving Rose this time. He's not saving the president's daughter, or his own wife, he's saving his own daughter. So, boss fights in this game tend to play pretty similar to Resident Evil 7. Alcina Dimitrescu, it's very much walk around and keep yourself protected, shoot her weak spot, similar to other Resident Evil games. Heisenberg, it's shoot his weak spots. Moreau, once again, figure out his weaknesses and exploit them. And also, avoid his splurge, because no one likes that. However, there are a couple of bosses in this game that are quite different. The doll boss fight and the entire House of Beneviento section is kinda unique. Here we step away from a lot of the standards of Resident Evil, like weapons, and instead it becomes more like one of those walking horror experiences, if you know what I'm talking about. Ethan can't fight the big baby thing, and instead you just have to hide. I find it interesting that they put this section into the game. It's pretty unique, and certainly very creepy, but it does feel a little out of place within the rest of the game. And then we have Miranda's boss fight. Now, Miranda's boss fight almost feels like an Elden Ring or Souls-like boss fight. For example, I don't know many Resident Evil games where you have to hide behind objects to avoid a lot of projectiles like this. This is something that I see more in Souls-like games. Her movement, where she dashes across the arena like this, is more reminiscent, once again, of a Souls-like. Now, maybe it's just me getting my wires crossed in my brain, but I kind of feel like it has a Souls-like feel to it, which is kind of, once again, out of place within the rest of the game. Another very cool aspect to this game that I actually really enjoyed was the secret areas. You can explore and find so many cool things within the game. And those little puzzle rolling ball things to get the big crystals, I actually really enjoyed those. The enemy variety was pretty good, and the enemies as a whole were tough but fair. They also added some interesting modes as part of DLC, sort of post-game content, like third-person mode. Third-person mode is strange to play in. It makes it feel a lot more like Resident Evil 4, and I enjoy that, but I also enjoy first-person still, because it makes the game feel a little bit more unique, and it's a little less jarring than switching repeatedly from first to third person for cutscenes. They also added the Mercenaries mode, which is a lot of fun, and the Shadows of Rose DLC. At the time of recording this, I haven't finished Shadows of Rose. However, I also feel that it doesn't matter. The story of Resident Evil 8 should stand on its own, regardless of the DLC. However, I will touch on the gameplay of the Shadows of Rose DLC is pretty cool and very unique, and certainly steps away from classic Resident Evil. Now, to finish off this analysis, I'll give my thoughts. I enjoyed the game. I thought it was pretty good, and warranted multiple playthroughs. I enjoyed it enough to come back to it. However, obviously, there is better. There is better within the Resident Evil franchise. There's some better within the horror genre of games. Overall, I really enjoyed the game. And despite its quirks, and because of its goofiness, I did really enjoy it. It made me laugh at times. It made me a bit emotional when we lost Ethan at the end. If there's one thing I'm glad to say, it's that they turned the dial to a 10. But, at the same time, maybe they should have cranked it to an 11. The House of Beneviento, I feel, could have been expanded a bit more. There were parts where the house was cut off, and it felt a little bit limited. And Heisenberg's factory felt a bit repetitive at times. I also feel that we moved on from the biggest and best section, the Castle Dimitrescu, a bit too quickly. And there are some parts where the emotions don't hit. That's all from me for now. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like. And if you want to keep up to date and follow me as I upload more of these analysis videos on games and movies, subscribe. I'll be releasing more of these videos on a regular basis. Thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.